The
Okay.
Civil War was two steps. The first step is the South secedes. And it's not the whole South. It's not even all the cottons, not even all the slave states. It's the seven what we call cotton states in the Deep South. That began with South Carolina, Nikki Haley state, of course,
Of course, yeah.
paying close attention to the news. And South Carolina seceded in December of 1860. This is right after Lincoln was elected.
Mr. Lowenstein, it's a pleasure to have you on our program again. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Did slavery cause the Civil War, or was slavery the underlying cause of the Civil War? I'm not trying to get cute with words here. I think there's a difference.
Yeah. Well, Adel, first, it's great to be back on your show. And everyone wants to force this question into an 8-word soundbite. So let me just take a little more. Obviously, slavery was one of the main underlying causes of the war. There had been 10 years, more than 10 years of heated battles in Congress, Kansas-Nebraska Act, 8 Compromise of 1850, many of these battles between North and South over the issue of slavery. So this is brimming, it's simmering, it's heating up. When you get to the actual war itself, the shooting war that started in April of 1861, I think you have to look very carefully.
This is like almost a month after Lincoln becomes president.
It's a month after Lincoln became president, and it's many years after the North and South have clearly been divided over slavery. I mean, if they just wanted to have a war over slavery, they could have gone to war in 1850 or in 1852 or 1854, because the South was very firm. They were not going to give up slavery. As the Republicans rose in the North, they were very firm. They didn't like it, but they didn't go to war. But something happened. Something happened to get to your question now, to actually cause it. And if we look carefully at how the Civil War started, it really happened in two parts. When I say two parts,
okay,
if you think just for a second about America getting into World War II, there was one action. There were underlying causes, but Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The next day, FDR's in Congress. A date that will live in infamy. We're at war. One thing, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. It was one step. The Civil War was two steps. The first step is the South secedes. And it's not the whole South. It's not even all the cottons, not even all the slave states. It's the seven what we call cotton states in the Deep South.
Wait. Let me make sure I follow you. You're saying not the entire South seceded. Only 7 states that produce cotton.
Only 7 states produced that were primarily cotton: South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and so on. So Arkansas, 7 of them. That began with South Carolina, Nikki Haley state, of course.
Of course, yeah.
Paying close attention to the news. And South Carolina seceded in December of 1860. This is right after Lincoln was elected. And they seceded really because they were afraid that the incumbent Republicans were a very anti-slavery party. Although the Republicans had promised up and down they were not going to attack slavery in the states where it existed. They were only going to restrict slavery from going into new states, Kansas and the states further west.
So what this means is that we're not going to attack the existence of slavery. We're going to prevent its expansion.
That's right. And the Republicans said that again and again. Lincoln said that again and again. And as the southern cotton states begin to secede, Lincoln and the Republicans reinforce that. They offer them guarantees, even a constitutional amendment to promise to never interfere with slavery, which was not much of an offer because in Lincoln's mind, they didn't have the legal right. And the law was very important to Lincoln. The law is very important to Lincoln. They had the right.
They didn't have the legal right to secede. Is that what you mean?
No, they didn't have the right to tell the states what institutions they could have to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
They had the right in federal territories because they were federal, not to permit slavery there, but they didn't have the right. So they were not wiping out slavery. Meanwhile, the southern states are seceding, and there's no war. South Carolina secedes in December. Buchanan says, in effect, and Horace Greeley, erring sisters go in peace. South Carolina is followed by Mississippi, by Louisiana, by the others I mentioned. I think all those, the other 6, in January. Now, these states, they're not declaring war. They don't want a war. They would, when the war started, and I have many accounts of this in my book, that they were shocked. As one of them said, war was not part of the plan. They just wanted to be separate. They would have slavery. They would have, their institutions, their culture based around slavery, but other differences as well, not industrial, more agrarian, many differences, and the North would be up there. Lincoln, however, has taken an oath, or takes an oath on March 4th, to defend the Constitution. And the Constitution, as he reads it, is protects all the states and protects them in one union. And he believes he's sworn to defend that union. So ultimately, and this is April, this is a month after he takes office, and it's November, December, January, February, March. It's about 4.5 months after the secession start. He sends ships down to Charleston Harbor,
Fort Sumter,
to reinforce a federal fort. And the South, the Confederacy, the now newly named nation of the Confederacy, seeing its territory invaded, fires, and the war starts. So why did the North send those ships? The North really provoked the war. The South did not want war. Lincoln provoked the war for what reason? And he said this again and again. And that reason is because the South has seceded. The South had violated the compact of the states to be one union. And he says repeatedly, and it's in every letter of the time that discusses it. I found a letter where someone's a soon-to-be soldier writes to his mother in Europe saying this war is not being fought over slavery. Now, everybody knows slavery is in the background, because what's the big difference between these two sides that are at war? The big difference is one of them has slave labor and one of them mostly doesn't. Although there are some, we should note, there are 4 slave states who never will succeed and will fight, with the Union. I'm
sorry, you said 4 slave states did not secede and fought along
Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. I mean, that's right. And after some skirmishing, it's not clear. Maryland at the beginning is very secessionist. It's very hot, but ultimately these four states remain with the Union. They're slave states. By the way, that's another evidence. There are slave states. What are they fighting for? They're certainly not fighting for emancipation, because they're slave states.
Mr. Lowenstein, I want to interrupt you, please, and get some perspective on what Lincoln was thinking, his point of view at that time. We're talking about 1860 and protecting the Union. I'm trying to understand for myself is if the word union was as important then as it is now to us in 2023.
It was very important to Lincoln for reasons I'll get to, but it was also very fraught. So why is it very important? Lincoln grows up for a few years in Kentucky, then Indiana, and then Illinois. He makes his business, which of course is law, but he's really a commercial lawyer. He's representing railroads. He's representing people with claims against railroads.
Yeah.
He's very involved. Before that, he clerks for a store, which goes bust, which fails. He has a number of other jobs. He's very involved in the commerce of the country. And in today, if you want to buy something, you go on Amazon and you buy it. But back then, there was no Amazon. There was no one currency. There weren't rivers to get you to big cities if you were in parts of the country like where Lincoln was. And the union of the country, being able to get goods, particularly from the interior of the country, from places like Salem, Illinois, or Springfield, Illinois, to the big cities in the East, that was everything. It meant if you were a farmer that your crops wouldn't spoil on the way to port, and they'd be worth something. That was just everything. And to have any economic hope, and he always, when he talked about the strength of democracy, it was prosperity. And if the Union couldn't be prosperous, he always felt that would be it would be a failing. The American dream was hinged on its prosperity, and he felt they had to be a union. He gave a speech where he said, together as one country, we're connected to ports to every continent. From the West Coast, we can go to Asia. From the South, we can go to Latin America. From the East, we can go to Europe, of course. But if we separate, no one part of the country can access all of these, much less access each other. And he was um, uh, uh, Richard Hofstadter, the famous historian, said something. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially he said to Lincoln, the acid test of a democracy was economic, and he really felt that the union would rise or fall on being a union. Now he also realized, growing up in the states that he grew up in, and they were basically not abolitionist states. Kentucky was a slave state. Southern Illinois, where he came from, was had a lot of Kentuckians in it. They fled there. They were very not only anti-abolition. They passed black laws to prevent blacks from settling there, to prevent them from voting there, to prevent them serving on juries. There's no other word to use for Illinois in 1860. It was a very racist place. Lincoln, ran against Stephen Douglas as an anti-slavery candidate in 1858, and of course
Wow.
lost.
Wow. Before
So,
we talk about the nature of
let me just finish where that point is going. Is
huh?
Lincoln knew that to take too strong a stand would be a political suicide. That to make a union of this country, and even a union of the North, he had to be very careful in
Political stance on slavery, you mean?
on slavery, and
Yeah.
on what we now call civil rights,
Yeah.
on equality, social equality for blacks who were free.
When I asked you about union, their perspective of the term of the word union back in the 1850s, coming up to the Civil War, in comparison to ours, you said you wanted to share with me Lincoln's, which you did, view, but you also said the term was fraught. Let's
Well,
talk about that part.
fraught because uh, the South obviously wanted slavery. In places like Massachusetts, where I live in New England, there were more abolitionists, but there weren't many blacks in New England, so
Yeah.
they were almost uh, uh, armchair integrationists. Uh,
Yeah.
but in the areas of the country that were very much mixed, which had more blacks living in them, more Southerners drifting up, places like Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, places that remarkably today even we think of as swing states.
Yeah.
Elect, the country had very different feelings. They would never have voted for government to go to war for the purpose of freeing the slaves. They would never have gone to war for freeing the slaves. Lincoln was very clever in a sense. He took warships down. So even his cabinet was against, by the way, going to war. Even his own
Wow.
cabinet. But he
Wow.
was very clever. He took warships down there, just he said, to reprovision. And when he was fired on, when the Union ships were fired on, that sort of raised the cry. Now we have to fight back. Honor meant a lot in the 19th century, and in effect, he furnished the excuse to go to war. But there was there wasn't really a sentiment in the South or in the North to go to war before it happened.
That's fascinating. First of all, you said he was careful to send the ships to Fort Sumter, which I've visited and I encourage our audience to visit, um, to reprovision. This is not to go fight a war. We're just sending supplies over there,
Yes, now
basically.
the supplies might include arms, but
Yeah.
certainly food, and they would reprovision the fort to withstand Southern attack. But he was not going to offload troops.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
So with
and the
all of
South, by
this,
the way, the South at that point, remember I said only 7 states had seceded. Those 7 did not notably include North Carolina or Virginia. Virginia was a border state. It was
yeah.
by far and away the most industrial state. If you look at it geographically, it occupies this prime territory between Maryland and Pennsylvania in the north, Pennsylvania to the west and the south. Without Virginia, the South couldn't have lasted, nearly 4 years. And the South felt that to rally these other Southern states, Virginia was a slave state, but it wasn't a slave state, didn't have the proportion of slaves, didn't have the cotton. It was slowly shifting to industries that weren't as dependent on slavery, unlike Mississippi and Alabama, which were all in for cotton and rice and all in for slavery.
Yeah.
So Jefferson Davis and the states that had seceded felt that to get these border states to go in with them, they would have to provoke a war and call on their honor, in quotes, as Southerners and as fellow slaveholders to go in, and that's what they did.
So you're talking about how the South rallied other reluctant Southern states to join the war. And before that, you said several stuff that were fascinating. Many of these states were not abolitionists. They even had black laws, for crying out loud. So from what I hear from you is that Northerners, it doesn't seem like they would go and die to free enslaved blacks.
Illinois had an election in 1862. It was in the summer. It's when Lincoln, their favorite son, when
So we're
Lincoln,
like about a year into the war.
4 year plus into the war, Lincoln's working on the Emancipation Proclamation.
Mm-hmm.
Illinois at the time is redoing its own constitution and it has two referenda. One is whether or not blacks should be able to move in, and the other is whether or not blacks should be able to vote. And the one on whether or not blacks should be able to move in is easily voted down. The one on whether or not they should be able to vote is voted down is rejected 7-1. In fact,
Wow.
a reporter for the New York Times is there, and he writes back and he says, again, I'm paraphrasing, but it's completely accurate in the sense of it. He says, not in any of Jefferson Davis's councils, will you find such a prejudicial, vote or reaction.
And Jefferson Davis being the president of the South. So if that's the case, how did Lincoln rally Northerners to go fight this war?
Well,
does it go back to Union that you were saying?
The mentality is really, the honor really carried a lot of weight. They were fired on. You have to read these accounts. New York State was a completely copperhead, meaning leaning pro-Southern state. All these merchants dominated New York. They didn't want to lose their cotton business, their trade. It's really on the brink of treason. And once Fort Sumter attacks, or Fort Sumter is attacked, by the Confederacy, all of a sudden the brass bands are marching. There are huge crowds. Even the Democratic financiers in New York start coughing up big money to form regiments, because this is what happened that day. It didn't all come from the federal government. The states, often supported by private donors, bought the uniforms, the ammunitions, and so on. And
private donors. Interesting.
Yes,
okay.
They accepted it from all sources. They raised bonds. The states raised bonds, and New York is all of a sudden gaga for war. It is just it's sort of the way things were in the 19th century. Somewhat like they continued to be in World War I. I think that was the last time that people got very rip roaring excited.
Yeah. It's kind of a romantic notion of
romantic notion. We'll all be home
chivalry
for Christmas.
Yeah.
There is a resolution, I should point out, and I don't want to say that slavery. I want to keep stressing it was the underlying difference between two sections. It's in everybody's mind, and Southerners in their diaries are writing. I wonder if slavery is going to last this war, but nobody knows the mechanism. The North continues to say once the war is started that slavery is not the root. In fact, one senator and one congressman, both from loyal slave states, proposed a resolution in the Congress. This is in July 1861, several months into the war, saying this war is not being fought to to upend any Southern institution. That's the way they put it. Upend slavery. It overwhelmingly passes. And by the way, the Congress is at that point overwhelmingly Republican, because most of the Democrats are Southerners and they're seceded. So the Congress is on record as saying we are not fighting this war to upend or to do anything about slavery. So in fact, this is so emphatic that Horace Greeley, the famous journalist, gets so fed up. He says to Lincoln, he writes a famous column, since the prayer of 20 millions. 20 million is essentially the population of the northern states, the loyal states. The prayer of 20 million that you will free the slaves. And I don't really think he was right. There was no majority of Northerners who felt that way. And Lincoln answers him back in very measured terms. He said, and there's no clear definition from Lincoln of his purposes in this. He said, if I could win this war, if I could preserve the Union by freeing no slaves, I would do it. And if I could preserve the Union by freeing every slave, I would do it. And if I could preserve the Union by freeing some slaves and not others, I would do it. And that
Oh,
is
wow.
basically the landscape, before the Emancipation Proclamation, which is now just several months away. And I just want you to consider one thought experiment until we get there, which is late in the war, when the South is desperate for men, they begin to consider emancipating the slaves. I just want you to consider this. So suppose they've been
Wow.
but let me just pose this thought experiment. Suppose they had been very forward thinking, and several months into the war, they say, slaves are beginning to self-emancipate, to escape. This is becoming a real problem. We're bleeding men on the farms. We don't have enough troops. What if we emancipated the slaves? Then, we'd have all these men to fight for us. They'd be loyal. They'd be grateful. What if they had freed the slaves? And Jefferson Davis had sent a telegram to Lincoln saying, the slaves are free now. If you're just fighting for slavery, you can put down your arms and we'll be two separate nations, but you don't have to fight. Well, no way. Lincoln's not going to stop fighting.
Yeah, based on what you just shared with us, he would continue to fight. It's the
He's
Union.
he's fighting to preserve the Union.
Yeah.
Now, things are going to evolve, and you'll ask me about that. Things are going to evolve.
Yeah.
In terms of what got us to this point, slavery is there absolutely underlying it, but it's not why the North goes to war.
Interesting. We'll be back after a short break to talk about much of what we've been talking about so far. Evolution of Lincoln's stance on slavery. We'll be right back.